Hello and welcome back. So we are now moving from the more emotional, affective, feeling-based side of things, at least a little bit, into the realm of cognition, your beliefs, and the things you could actually explicitly say about what you think and feel about the world. In other words, we're going to be talking about attitudes. And attitudes, it turns out, are one of the most broadly, widely, deeply studied constructs in social psychology. They might seem basic, but it turns out there's actually a lot of oomph there. Now, just a quick clarification. When we're talking about attitudes, we do not mean a good attitude or a bad attitude. We do not mean like a more positive or negative outlook. Instead, the way that social psychologists talk about attitudes is that it is your global evaluation of something. Break down what both of those things mean in just a second. So we can have attitudes towards specific people. We can have attitudes towards ideas or policies. We can have attitudes about certain classes of objects, like whether or not you really adore a gooey, buttery croissant, or whether actually you really prefer other kinds of breakfast food. We can even have attitudes, more positive or more negative, towards, let's say, a wildly popular pop song. In all of these cases, whether we're talking about the feeling that you have towards a song, towards a policy or an idea, a kind of thing, or a particular person, maybe even a broad social group, right? When we talk about attitudes, we're talking about the basic feeling that you have towards something. So this is why attitudes are still, to some extent, in the realm of emotion or affect. What this means is that attitudes in their most basic form are this spectrum from extremely negative, extremely aversive, to really positive, things that you feel a warm, fuzzy glow towards. Attitudes can vary in a lot of different ways. Some attitudes are argued to be more explicit. These are the things that we know we feel about a person, a thing, a group, and we would be able and willing to report back how we feel. I can probably tell you whether or not I like croissants. There are more implicit attitudes. These are the things that are murkier. They're under the surface. They're less likely to be represented in an explicit belief or statement, and more so it may be a shadowy gut level feeling. For instance, if I am, less comfortable with women than men, right? Let's say I had some kind of underlying implicit misogyny, this might not be something I would consciously recognize. It would be more likely to be revealed in little split-second impressions, split-second facial expressions, split-second feelings that I have. So attitudes also vary, not just in being more implicit or explicit, but they can be stronger, more intense, or more or less accessible. So a very strong, accessible attitude would be something where when you think of that object or that person or that idea, you almost immediately feel an overpowering reaction, and you know how you feel. This is in contrast to attitudes that might be weaker, more wishy-washy, or more remote. You really have to dig down to access them. Maybe a policy or a person you're not as familiar with, and you really have to construct how you feel about it. So one of the reasons we bother to lay out all these little gradations or distinctions about attitudes and how they can vary is because we usually want to use attitudes to predict behavior. If I'm asking you how you feel about the environment, how you feel about sustainability, how you feel about climate change, I may want to know that because I want to know your likelihood of recycling, your likelihood of voting for candidates who support more environmentally friendly policies, your likelihood of taking shorter showers or using the train instead of the plane, right? It turns out that attitudes often have a mild, a kind of medium level connection to behavior. Sometimes it's really strong. Sometimes attitudes barely predict what you actually do in your everyday life. And here are some factors that tend to moderate that relationship. Attitudes tend to be the most predictive of behavior if your attitude is really strong. If you are die-hard about sustainability, that is something you have a gut reaction to, I can probably bet that you're the person who's likely to sort your recycling. If your attitude is accessible, so it kind of goes hand in hand with being strong. But let's say I ask you how you feel about the environment, and you can respond to me in a split second. Yep, all about the green policies. If it takes you a minute to really think about how you feel, if it's not front of mind, it's less likely to be there guiding your behavior when you actually have to make the decision. Do I throw this in the trash can or do I walk it to the recycling? And finally, and this is really important, and I apologize, I think I'm cutting this off again, one key thing to consider is you can measure attitudes at different levels of specificity and granularity. You can also measure behaviors at different levels of specificity and granularity, and the connection between the two tends to be the strongest when you're measuring them at the same level. It turns out empirically that if I ask you how you feel about the environment or how you feel about sustainability in the broadest possible terms, and then I'm trying to figure out whether or not you specifically recycle your glass bottles, that link is likely to not be very strong. I would want to ask you specifically your attitudes toward recycling and then measure recycling behavior. Or I could ask you how you feel about sustainability in a general sense and then measure many different types of behaviors in which you might express your commitment to sustainability. Recycling, and also your mode of transport, and also taking shorter showers, and also the political candidates and policies you support. And if I aggregate across all of those, that's where we're likely to see the strong correlation with your big, broad attitude about sustainability. All right, so now you know when attitudes are likely to predict behavior. You know what attitudes are, what we mean when we're talking about this as social psychologists. We're going to use this in the next couple of videos you're going to watch, including when attitudes tend to change and what we do about attitudes and beliefs and behaviors that aren't always consistent within an individual. Thanks, folks.